Hi, today I'm going to talk about the American philosopher and educational theorist John Dewey. I want in particular to talk about his ethics. Many people have written and talked about his ideas about educational reform and the way in which they've shaped the past century's worth of education in the United States and in other countries. Today I want to talk about the philosophical ideas that underlie Dewey's approach to education and a variety of other social issues. John Dewey was born in Burlington, Vermont, and attended the University of Vermont. He then decided he wanted to be a school teacher, so he did that for a couple of years in Oil City, Pennsylvania, and then in a small town in Vermont. He decided that teaching school was not for him, so it's somewhat ironic he became the great educational reformer. He decided he really wasn't suited for the classroom. But in any case, he decided to go get a PhD, which he did at Johns Hopkins. He then joined the faculty at the University of Michigan, then later Chicago, and then Columbia. And so I want to talk today about the ideas that underlie his approach to education and a wide variety of other problems. They really have their roots in philosophy. Now, he wrote about epistemology, he wrote about logic, but he also wrote about ethics, and that's what I want to focus on today. What were Dewey's ethical ideas? He expressed his views about ethics in two books, Ethics, published in 1932, and A Theory of Valuation, published in 1939. Dewey objects to a lot of traditional approaches to ethics and to thinking about moral problems and practical problems in general. Partly, he says, ethics has tended to concentrate on articulating ethical rules, ethical principles, or sometimes, in the Aristotelian tradition, lists of virtues. He says that's not the right way of going about it. We shouldn't be trying to identify rules. We shouldn't be thinking of ethics in general as something that's trying to describe a realm of normative facts. So he is rejecting moral realism. He says morality and practical considerations in general are not descriptions of anything. They are prescriptions. They have a different character. And so we shouldn't think of them on analogy with descriptive statements like the grass is green, nor should we think of them in terms of just reducing them to some expression of attitudes, as expressivists and others do. Instead, he says they have a different character, and we derive them in a different way. As you might expect, given his affiliation with the pragmatist movement, it's a pragmatic way. And so Dewey, whether he calls himself an instrumentalist or a pragmatist, is going to have a distinctive and very different approach to problems of ethics and problems of a practical nature, whether they're individual or social, educational, and so on. He is going to say we use a different kind of technique. We are not describing anything. We're not describing character traits. We are not simply expressing emotions or anything like that. We've got something else in mind, something that is, in its orientation, thoroughly practical. After all, what is the normative? It is something connected to action, something connected to practical problems and practical solutions to them. An absolute key to Dewey's approach to ethical thinking, and to thinking in general, really, is that it is a dynamic process. In most thinking, of belief revision. However, in the case of ethics, or anything normative, it is a case of attitude revision. We look at a certain practical problem, whether it's a personal problem or a social problem. We make some judgments about what to do, and then we try that out. Well, we have attitudes about this, we put those attitudes into action, and then we see the consequences. Now, although later he expresses a view that comes close to consequentialism, I don't think that's the essence of the view because it doesn't capture the dynamism. His thought is that practical thinking involves reacting to the consequences of our actions and then revising our attitudes, revising our approach to the problem. So we don't simply have a set of attitudes that are described as fitting for a situation and so on. It's not a fitting attitude theory. It is not the kind of thing that says we want to match our attitudes to something in the world. Instead, he says we try out attitudes and we revise them in light of experience. So we're something like scientists who formulate hypotheses and then test them through experimentation. Then we go about revising the hypotheses and eventually trying to formulate an acceptable theory that will withstand further experimentation. That's what we're doing in ethics too. We are trying out various attitudes and various approaches to solving problems. We see what happens. We adjust our attitudes. We adjust our strategies for coming up with solutions. And then we hope to achieve some form of stability where we've got something that is going to withstand future experiences, future attempts at problem solving. Now, maybe we reach such an equilibrium, such a stable point, maybe we don't. But the idea is that the core of ethics is not the outcome of that, whatever it might be. Instead, the core of ethics is the process of revising our attitudes, revising our strategies, revising our approaches to practical problems. Ethical judgments, then, shouldn't primarily be thought of as true or false. He's not denying that they could be viewed as true or false. That's not the point. The point instead is to say that they are basically tools, they are instruments for dealing with practical problems. And we examine them in the light of our experiences. We try them out. We see if the tool works, and if the tool works, we accept it. And if the tool doesn't work, we go about revising it or discarding it. So ethical judgments, he says, are not the endpoints of moral reasoning. Instead, they are part of this dynamic process. They are attempts to capture a formula that then we go about revising in light of further experience. So they are tools, but they're imperfect tools, and we go about improving them in the process of seeing what happens when we use them to solve particular practical problems. There are two factors that complicate this picture. One is that the world is constantly changing, and it's constantly giving us new problems to solve. That means that ethics is very unlikely, he thinks, to really remain stable for very long with a set of propositions that simply work and that we accept and have consensus about. Instead, he says we're constantly having to revise. It's not just that we can't really reach a point where our ethical judgments are fully adequate. It's that the world keeps changing on us. And so even if we attain something that is adequate given the past, it may not be adequate in the future. Now, partly that's due to technological changes, social changes, political changes, but partly it's simply a matter of our experience, both individually and even collectively as a species, being finite. And so as we go into the future, we're going to encounter a lot of situations that we haven't encountered before. People like us haven't encountered before. Maybe nobody in humanity has encountered before. And we have to deal with those problems. So we can expect ethics to change, to develop. We can't expect it to remain stable for all that long. There's another complication, which is that ethical judgments are context dependent. We're looking at something that will be an effective tool in this situation. And so we're applying an instrument in a given context. Hammers are very useful in lots of contexts, but sometimes they aren't. Sometimes they can't solve the problem. Are hammers good for driving in nails? Well, yes, in general, but in some particular contexts they aren't. Maybe you're expecting them to drive through metal, or in this case, just something that was an incredibly hard-pressed wood, wouldn't work. And so what we have to do is recognize that ethical judgments are going to be relative to context. And that's going to limit their universality. So even apart from the fact that the world is constantly changing and that we're going to face new problems as we go on in time, we've also got this problem that as we go from context to context, even in things as they are now, we may find that we have to adjust our judgments. Something that works very effectively as a problem solver in one context may not solve the problem in another context. Dewey says that ethics is really analogous to other realms where we're primarily solving problems and coming up with prescriptions, deciding what to do, rather than simply describing the world. So he says, yes, there is an analogy between scientific method and ethical thinking as a dynamic process of attitude revision. On the other hand, he says, we shouldn't take that too seriously, because physics, for example, chemistry, biology, they're trying to describe the world, or at least certain features of it. But he says ethics is more like engineering. It's more like medicine or architecture. It's trying to solve a certain practical problem. And so the primary question here isn't really what is true, but instead, what do we do? And it's about doing, it's about coming up with prescriptions for action, rather than simply giving us a description of the world. So we should think of that family of disciplines things like medicine and engineering and architecture as having the same general structure as ethics. It's practically oriented, and something that's an effective principle of architecture, for example, or of engineering in one context may not apply in another context. So we have to be context sensitive just as they are. Notice that one treatment that might work very well for one patient might not work for another. And so similarly, we might find that for some people, certain ethical principles work very well to solve problems. For others, they don't. In some situations, they work well. In others, they don't. In some cultures, they work well. In others, they don't. And so Dewey says we've got to be careful about overgeneralizing our judgments. It may be that even though this ethical principle has been working very well for us, given our experiences so far, there may be others in the future, or people may be encountering other contexts where those principles don't work at all. This dynamic approach to ethics leads Dewey to reject a number of traditional ideas. For example, he says ethics is not a priori. It is something we develop through a dynamic process of attitude revision as we confront practical problems. So it is thoroughly a posteriori. It is dependent on experience. We can't derive ethical judgments independently of experience. Also, there's no such thing as an intrinsic good. Are there goods we value purely for their own sake, not for the sake of something else? He says no. Really, we value everything for the sake of, well, living successfully, for the sake of actually solving the practical problems that we have. And so he says there's really nothing that we can count as simply good for its own sake. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, what about success in living? Isn't that good for its own sake? But I think Dewey would say, no, even that really isn't, because that's so vague, so general, that it really doesn't give us any content. We're dealing with different kinds of practical problems in different kinds of circumstances and in different kinds of eras. And so to say, yeah, we want to succeed in solving practical problems, well, yes, but because of the nature of that practical problem. There isn't one thing that we're trying to achieve as a result of, solving this practical problem and that practical problem. We're trying to achieve all sorts of different things. So for the same reason, he says, there is no ultimate good, there is no highest good, there's no summum bonum, because we're just facing lots of different problems. Hey, where do I get something to eat? I'm thirsty. I want something to drink. I'm trying to figure out this problem, but I don't know how to do it. I need to find some people who have dealt with something like this before. Those are different kinds of practical problems. And do our goals in those cases have something in common, something that would count as a highest good or an ultimate good or a final good? He says, it's dubious. The only way to come up with anything like that is to drain it of all content. And so he says, don't look for that kind of thing. So many ethicists, in his view, throughout history have wasted their time thinking, what is the highest good? What is an ultimate good? What is a final good? Always valued for its own sake, never for the sake of something else. He says there's no such thing. For the same reason, there is no fundamental principle. There's no such thing as the golden rule, or the principle of utility, or the categorical imperative, or any other one principle that's going to give us the answers to all ethical problems. Not to say there's something wrong in particular with those approaches, it's just that we face lots of different practical problems and we're going to need lots of different principles and we're going to go about revising them in that dynamic process of trying to solve problems in the context of experience. So how should we think about ethics, ethical propositions, or ethical attitudes for that matter? He says don't think of them as propositions. Again, it's not a question that they aren't truth out, they couldn't be true or false. That's not the point. The truth or falsehood, he said, that's sort of not the central issue. The central issue is that they are heuristics. They give us guidance about what to do, about how to go about solving practical problems. And they may give good guidance, they may give bad guidance, they may give, and this is the typical case, pretty good guidance, but it's going to have to be refined, revised in light of our experiences. And so he says, think of these as heuristics. Something like, hey, if you're faced with this kind of problem, start here. That's more analogous to an ethical proposition and to what we can expect from ethics. Ethics is highly useful, he says. This isn't to dismiss it, because it does give us helpful heuristics. On the other hand, they are heuristics. They're general strategies for going about solving practical problems. They aren't propositions, they aren't descriptions, they aren't merely expressions of emotions or other attitudes. Instead, he says they are heuristics we develop in the context of experience as we grow in our ability to solve practical problems.